Welcome to American Education FM, everybody. I'm Dr. Sean Brooks. Welcome back, everybody. I'll tell you what, here's where I want to start with this one. On Monday, I'm going to have a Substack out there. It's very quick, but it's a very fast little look at the Tavistock Institute. And this is, again, one of those NGOs that is really not discussed very often, and they really do have their fingers in the cookie jar of mass manipulation. Within that brief article, I reference another article of an individual, again, summarizing the history of the Tavistock Institute basically as quickly as possible. And then below that, you'll see a 17-minute video. I highly recommend watching that video. It really is interesting. And again, when it comes to institutions like this and NGOs like this, they do know what they're doing. They do have individuals out there, of course, in the banking system and the media and entertainment, quote unquote, that basically, again, take their ideas and then push them out there into the mainstream so that everybody sort of at least sees it and or hears it, and then individuals are easily manipulated as a result. Again, that 17-minute video speaks for itself, so again, it'll be at the end of the article, and I just highly recommend checking that out if you can. Okay, here's where I want to start. First of all, last week, of course, in education, I was bringing up a lot of financial stuff and a lot of financial examples of the collapse. And, of course, a number of different money laundering techniques that the education business engages in. One of those, as you might expect, which shouldn't shock anybody, is the business of testing. And this, again, was thrown my way because there are numerous states, of course, across the United States that did away with ACT testing and SAT testing. And as it turns out, many of them did away with it, not only because of the whole COVID lie and all of that stuff, and it messed up the timing of schooling and, of course, pulling everybody out and then students going back and then the mask wearing lie and all of that. That, of course, just tipped everything upside down. But one of the other reasons that they got rid of it, of course, had to do with all of the DEI nonsense, and that it's not inclusive and it doesn't take this into consideration and that into consideration. And there were numerous years, as a matter of fact, of endless individuals. I've even played some audio here on the show of individuals attempting to take those tests, doing poorly, and saying, well, the test wasn't written for me because I'm Mexican, or the test wasn't written for me because I'm black, or the test wasn't written for me because I'm of European descent, or whatever. I mean, they just made up numerous excuses as to why they were doing poorly on these exams. Now, with that even that point aside, the whole ACT, SAT thing is completely fraudulent. And it's completely, of course, also tied to money. Endless schools use this because it's a money-grabbing scheme. You take the test once, it costs a great deal of money. You take the test twice, well, it's twice as much, and so on and so on. But again, during 2020, a lot of these schools got rid of it. And again, a lot of that had to do with the COVID lie, with a combination of DEI, like I just said. But now some of them are having the ACT and SAT tests return. They're not having them return because they think that it's a useful test or a useful examination. They're having them return because they want the money. They need the money. And again, in typical fashion, given the fact that they're going broke and they have less individuals showing up, they have to do whatever they can to milk as much money out of the people who are actually attending or want to attend as they possibly can. So here on horizoneducation.com, there's a list of about 44 schools, and these are all colleges and universities. And this list, again, was published on May 3rd, but it was titled List of Colleges Dropping and Reinstating ACT, SAT Requirements. Of this list of 44 schools, almost all of them did not require the ACT or SAT during 2020. So for Ivy League schools, very quickly, this included Brown University, Columbia, Cornell, Dartmouth, Harvard, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, and Yale. The test was optional. You didn't have to take it in order to apply. And if you got in, you still didn't have to take it. You didn't have to take it. It's basically that simple. Again, back in 2020, Florida State University required it. The Georgia Institute of Technology required it. Let me see here. I'm just scrolling down. University of Florida, University of Georgia, they required it, and that was it. All these other schools, and it's, again, a list of 44 of them, all these other schools did not require it. Now what you have is of those 44 schools, 11 of them have reinstated it. So, again, Is it because they think that it's a valid test? No. Again, they did away with it for years here, and now they're bringing it back. So again, they're not bringing it back because it's a valid examination of any kind. They're bringing it back because it's tied to money. In fact, when it comes to K-12 schools, you may even recall that during the fake pandemic stuff in 2020, they did away with the state standardized tests completely. In fact, that landed right before all of those tests were typically to be administered to students. And schools, of course, receive all of those materials and then dish out all those materials, and then they collect all the materials and then they send them all back, and then the data analysis takes place in the whole thing. In fact, there were numerous states that not only did that in 2020, but they pushed it well into 2021, if not 2022. So it's just funny, again, in the education business, because anytime that they eliminate something and they have some kind of an excuse, basically, for eliminating a particular program, a test, an evaluation, a measurement, whatever it may be, it's only a matter of time before they bring it back. But again, tying into what I said last week, it always has to do with money. It has nothing to do with the fact that the thing that they're bringing back is so important. So I just wanted to mention that again very quickly. It's an odd thing, but again, it's one of those things that the education business just doesn't want to learn from. They really don't. I mean, they had a golden opportunity there to get rid of a measurement that doesn't measure much of anything at all. Again, it's supposed to generally be a measurement for college success, and that's clearly not the case. Lots of individuals, again, get into college without taking them, and they graduate from college just fine. That right there pretty much proves that the ACT and SAT tests are invalid. But again, it's the education business, and I think validity is not the thing that they're interested in. It certainly seems to be the case, and they have a long track record of that being the case. So there you go. Okay. Now there's this, and I want to read this in its entirety because this is remarkably important. Quite a history lesson as well, and this was tossed to me by our Virginia educator, and it really is an excellent article. And this is on the website traditionaction.org, and it's titled Women's Calisthenics, How the Cult to the Body Took Root. This is from a Miriam Horvat and an Elizabeth Lazowski. So let me get into this, and again, I'm going to have a few side stories regarding this particular subject because, again, as a former health education major and health teacher, this subject interests me without a doubt. This, too, of course, is a history lesson that we never received when we were in school, and it's really unfortunately led to sort of a very common state of affairs among some, where women have taken it upon themselves to essentially take on more masculine traits, certainly from a physical standpoint. And again, it even leads into a bit of the vanity that you see on YouTube with individuals taking cameras into gyms and fitness places and videoing themselves lifting weights and then putting it on the internet. Again, it leads to a number of different behaviors here that could all be problematic and certainly are. In fact, I think that even phenomenon right there is even not that old. I'd say 10 years old tops, maybe. The whole business of, again, women and men, but specifically women taking cameras into gyms and filming themselves exercising. I find it bizarre, but anyway, that's just me. So here's the article. Here's what it says. It says, quote, "In our previous article, we emphasized that modesty should be the first concern in sports and exercises for women. Unfortunately, shortly after sports for women were introduced into school curriculums, women abandoned modest clothing and adopted the new gym clothing, often rather culottes and then shorts, that purportedly aimed to allow more freedom of movement. However, underlying that excuse was the aim to promote the emancipation, quote-unquote, of women from the restraints, quote-unquote, of the past, which was the first glimmering of the women's liberation movement that eventually liberated women from every boundary, both physical and moral." It says, "To better understand the spirit behind its adoption, we thought it would be helpful to research the origins of physical education for women." Now again, very quickly, this is exactly what the Tavistock Institute is interested in, and I'm certain that they had a hand in this. Again, it's NGOs like this also that socially move people and move generations into doing particular things and then taking it to a next level to basically, again, just engage in social engineering as much as humanly possible. So it goes on here. It says the roots of PE classes. The first known physical education classes were introduced as a consequence of the modern quote-unquote thinking that emerged from the French Revolution of 1789. The French Revolution established committees for everything, including one for the physical education of girls and boys. The implementation and development of these first programs, however, would not become widespread until the mid-1800s. It was the German philanthropist teacher Johann Christoph Friedrich Gutsmuth who introduced systemic physical education into the school curriculums shortly after the French Revolution, with a focus on gymnastics that included exercise for men. It says, 1. He and all the modern educators of the time were strongly influenced by the revolutionary thinking of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It says Rousseau proposed man was good in nature, thus rejecting original sin. His naturalism insisted that the artificial and formal education of the past had deprived youth of the liberty to remain true to his original nature. Gutsmuth followed the late 18th century philanthropist movement, which continued the ideas of the Renaissance humanists, rejecting the teachings of the Middle Ages. Religious instruction was to be replaced by the teaching of the universal natural morality, which replaced the divine with nature. Gutsmuths described gymnastics as culture for the body, quote-unquote, with a primary aim being, quote, to attain the body's potential, beauty, and perfect usefulness. The focus was man, the beauty of the body. It says the self-styled grandfather of gymnastics, quote-unquote, only made a few references to exercise for women, but it was the hole in the dam that opened the way for the flood. Because of this rise of interest in gymnastics, teachers and philosophers began to wonder how a woman would benefit from fitness programs. One of the most famous teachers was Heinrich Sleus, if I'm saying that right, an American by birth who traveled around Europe teaching and promoting gymnastics at schools, primarily in England and France. He was a strong defender of the right of girls to take gymnastic classes. It says, in concession to the thinking of the times, Sleus and other early trainers taught that women's exercises should differ from men's, being less strenuous with an emphasis on developing gracefulness. Sleus, among others, was the first to dare to train a woman coach. The quite famous in her time calisthenics instructor, Marion Mason, became a popular figure among upper-class Protestant English women in the 1820s and 1830s. In 1826, Miss Mason, who never married in order to pursue her career in fitness, performed calisthenics to music appropriate for the softer sex, quote unquote, in a hall filled with men and women to illustrate her teaching method. For many, it was shocking, men watching a woman performing exercises in public. The next year, Miss Mason published on the utility of exercise, quote unquote, a short monograph that marked another first, making her the first female instructor to publish a text of this kind for women in Britain. It says the same year, 1827, saw the release of the much more popular Manual of Exercises for Women titled A Treatise on Calisthenic Exercises Arranged for the Private Tuition of Young Ladies, authored by Signor G.P. Verino, if I'm saying that right, in 1827. Verino's calisthenics were highly influential, especially among upper-class ladies, to whom he directed his treatise. They were more readily accepted because the exercises were not strenuous. The women wore simple but modest dresses, and the emphasis was on form and grace while building strength. The popularity of calisthenics for women in this early period was primarily in Protestant countries and the Protestant parts of Germany and France, where the upper set followed the enlightened thinking inspired by Rousseau and the French Revolution. Alongside the initial calls for greater political equality that suffragettes in England were already demanding, in the 1830s were calls to improve women's health with regular calisthenic programs for women. It is interesting to note that the roots of gymnasium exercises for women were deeply rooted in the ever-growing revolutionary clamors for equality of women and men. Then it says Bugeaud's and Beecher's introduction of aggressive exercises. In 1828, J.A. Bugeaud, if I'm saying that right, and his wife released a physical training book for women in schools, focusing on a much more rigorous gymnastics than Celius's work. Bugeaud and his wife jointly trained boys and girls in the Royal Hibernian Military School in Dublin. Although modesty was upheld in theory, in practice the reality was quite different. For unlike most advocates for women's fitness at the time, Bugeaud never recommended caution for the weaker sex overexerting herself, nor did he propose exercise as an aid for women to better perform her household duties. Further, Bugeaud recommended a gymnastics costume that included trousers with shorter skirts over top, similar to those seen in the picture of Verino's exercises. These were necessary for many of the aggressive exercises he taught to young women. Tendentially, it was a preparation for women donning trousers. It is apparent by just a few of these pictures that some of the postures required distorting the body and taking immodest poses. For example, some exercises included pull-ups on the bars and even punching into the air, in weak imitation of men's boxing exercises. Although not yet widely accepted, his revolutionary attitude towards women's athletic abilities was not without its supporters. Bugeaud's exercises could be dangerous and injuries were not infrequent. In 1829, Mr. Bugeaud himself broke his neck from a fall while swinging from a rope. In the wake of her husband's death, Mrs. Bugeaud established herself as an instructor in her own right using the same radical system. The very liberal Freemason, Horace Mann, so-called father of American education, supported Bugeaud and her system. He was joined by prominent Boston preachers who appeased the shocked Protestant conservatives who objected. Catherine Beecher, our next pre-feminist reformer, came from a family of Protestant abolitionists. It says in 1823, Beecher and her sister Mary founded the Hartford Female Seminary. In most female schools of the era, students learned primarily fine arts and languages, but Beecher offered a full range of subjects. Her aim to produce an army of women teachers, in reality, helped to transform teaching into women's work in America, and as a consequence, reduced the salary which discouraged men from entering the profession. An early pioneer of physical education for girls, Beecher introduced calisthenics to improve women's health and in defiance of prevailing notions of women's fragility. I got to stop real quick. I mean, that's incredible. That last paragraph is an education history lesson on the profession of education that no one's going to receive, and that the history of women in education was brought about via physical education being introduced into schools. Absolutely incredible. To discourage men from doing it and then pay women less. And again, treat it as if it's basically a household job. This is incredible. It goes on here, it says, quote, as we will see in our next article, if the idea that women must be perfectly fit and muscularly developed, is allowed to flourish in the minds of young women, nothing will prevent them from engaging in manly sports. These early reformers perhaps did not realize that the revolutionary gymnastic reforms would later end in competitive sports for women accompanied by immodest displays of the female form. But that is what happened, as can be seen today. And it says, as Professor Polino points out in his article on Gradualism, a new model of women began to emerge in the 19th century. A woman who, quote, breathes the taste for adventure, for the battles of life, similar to that of a man, which demands the development of typical masculine qualities, unquote, including a body trained for endurance and sports. These ground-level steps toward compulsory physical education for women were a part of the revolutionary process that led to the masculinization of women, which is ultimately a subversion of the natural order, unquote. It's absolutely remarkable. And I have to tell you, again, just from my own experience, I can't help but think of this. This is one of those things that I really witnessed really only when I was a high school teacher. It wasn't something that I saw a lot in middle school because, again, there weren't a lot of sports that were offered in middle school, both I was when I was in school as a student, but also as a school teacher. Although when I was in middle school, I was on the seventh grade wrestling team, and there was only one wrestling team for the entire school. And because it was wrestling at the time, and wrestling had never been there before, a lot of people wanted to be on the team. Now, of course, it's a guy's sport, and that's the way that it was at the time. There was one girl who was on our team, and she was determined to wrestle other guys, and she did from time to time. I believe she was in my weight class. I don't recall ever wrestling her. I don't think that I ever did. Certainly wasn't interested in it. But at the exact same time, I can't help but, again, fully recognize that she had her mother and her aunts and a lot of other women behind her saying, well, you need to be on the wrestling team. If that's what you want to do, then, you can do it. And just because there's guys there doing it, then, don't let them get in your way of you doing the thing that you want to do. Again, she got picked on by a lot of people in the school, not the people on the team. We didn't have a problem with her, but there were a lot of other individuals who were, of course, making fun of her. And I mean, okay, sure, I guess it was sort of warranted because it seemed odd that she would want to, dress up in the same little whatever onesie that we were all wearing, which again was weird. But it was, it was one of those sports where, again, if you wanted to participate at a young age and just give it a try, you could. Not to mention, as far as I was concerned, I grew up wrestling with my brother and my dad. So throwing people around on a mat, it was basically just called a Tuesday. Given that fact, not to mention all the WWE wrestling I used to watch as a kid, but when you put all that aside for a minute, there was a particular meeting or a match rather where she wanted to compete, and she was told that she was going to compete. But then she was bumping up against endless other individuals, of course, in society who were just like, yeah, you can't wrestle here. There are dudes on these other teams because these are all guy teams and they don't want to wrestle you. And so that was something that we all witnessed. And again, it made perfect sense from my standpoint. I was like, yeah, I fully understand people don't want to wrestle her. That makes complete sense. On top of that, I also watched this happen, and this is kind of interesting. During one of those matches, again, it was a guy who didn't want to wrestle her, who was in her weight class from another school, and the match was about to take place, and the guy again was about to begin the match, and he turned around and he walked back to the coach, and he said something to the coach, and then the coach grabs the referee. The referee comes over, and they're all talking just away from each other, and she's standing on the other side of the mat, and then they basically just sort of hammer out this agreement that what they're going to do is they're going to blame the length of her hair and say that if she doesn't either, I don't know, put some kind of a hairnet on top. Again, she had her hair in a bun, so it wasn't going to get in the way of anything. But they basically just said, your hair is too long, that's why you can't wrestle. And she started crying, and she ran off the mat, and that was that. And again, it was pretty clear that it had nothing to do with her hair. It just had to do with the fact that the guy didn't want to wrestle a girl. So, again, I see multiple angles of the whole thing. I mean, it's clearly a terrible experience for her, but the guy was like, "Hey, look, I don't, I don't want to wrestle a girl." So, I mean, that was sort of my first experience regarding all of that. My next one, as I said earlier, came when I was a high school teacher, and this was odd. And this is, again, it spills right into the whole gradualism kind of thing, and certainly peer pressure and physical education and wanting to look a particular way, and of course wanting to associate. But this specifically had to do with there being a female high school weightlifting team. And apparently, in Southwest Florida, there were other high school female weightlifting teams. Again, as far as I was concerned, it seemed completely unnatural to me. The irony, too, of course, was that I was teaching health education, anatomy, and physiology, and I didn't support this in the slightest. And I remember telling my students that, some of which, of course, were on that team. And you would look at them and you would say, you have no business being on any kind of a weightlifting team at all. Again, some of these girls were not big. They were very small and very thin. And I thought to myself, you're gonna hurt yourself. And I openly told them this, again, as professionally as I could and with warning and certainly care in my voice. I wasn't making fun of them by any stretch. But I remember telling them, when you have a young frame that is growing, in particular a skeletal system, and the whole object of this competition and these teams, which again, they would travel to compete and basically see how much, how much can you bench and how much can you squat and how much can you lift over your head. I mean, it's just nuts. Again, it just made no sense to me at the time, and it still doesn't. But again, you take a young developing skeletal system and then you ask it to lift copious amounts of weight over your head and then squat and then deadlift and bench press and whatever else. And you're going around from school to school doing this. That's going to have a massive negative impact on your skeletal system and your bone structure, without a doubt. And again, I found it remarkably ironic because the vast majority of these girls wanted to be thin. They wanted to be fit, but they wanted to be thin. And I remember looking at them again in a particular class, and I said, look, I said, when you put on this kind of muscle and bigger muscle, your bones are going to get larger. I said, but and thicker. But at the same time, so is that muscle. And then when you stop lifting, that muscle will turn into fat. And then you'll just be big. And I remember telling them this, and their eyes got kind of big because they weren't thinking further down the line for what this was actually going to do for their body. Well, wouldn't you know it, shortly after, as their quote-unquote season is taking place, which lasted almost an entire semester. I mean, it was bizarre. These girls were coming into class and walking around the school injured almost all of the time. They're like, oh, my back hurts. Oh, my knees hurt. My hips hurt. I pulled this. I pulled that. And then they'd have, ice packs on them. And I'm saying to myself, what are you doing? I mean, you're destroying your body for absolutely nothing. Now, with that said, I also found this a bit odd. The two female coaches were lesbians. Both of them were lesbians, and both of them were a couple. They were with one another sexually. And again, they were inviting all these girls in to, of course, do whatever they do. Again, get on a bus and compete from school to school and see how much they can lift over their head and squat and bench press and the whole thing. The whole activity from multiple angles made zero sense to me. And I just remember warning them and saying, look, again, you're going to hurt yourself. Your bone structure is going to change. Your muscle shapes are going to change. And then, of course, when you put all of this down and the season ends, you're just going to look bigger. And then finally, that's exactly what happened. A lot of these girls kept coming up to me, during the day or even in my class, and they'd say, you know what, Mr. Brooks, you were right. I can't lose this weight now. I'm bigger than I want to be. My clothes don't fit. My knee still hurts and this, that, and the other. And it's like, yeah, see, that's the whole problem. There's a difference between eating right and physically exercising and taking care of yourself with, again, light exercise, and then competing on a weightlifting team as a teenage female. I mean, those are, it's polar opposite stuff right there. But again, that's gradualism, as was brought up in the article. That is the definition of gradualism. And like I said earlier, that's Tavistock Institute stuff. That's exactly the kind of thing that they will create in a boardroom and then push on multiple people as if it's the thing to do. But they do it over time. It's just a little step at a time, decade after decade after decade, and then before you know it, 100 to 200 years later, you've got women on YouTube taking footage of themselves, lifting copious amounts of weight, and trying to see how thick their arms can be. Again, there's a huge gap between being physically fit and being tone or being lean, and again, taking care of oneself. And then at the exact same time, on the opposite end of the spectrum, engaging in a vain activity of filming yourself exercising to see how thick you can get and how much weight you can lift and what you can look like in skin-tight pants and skin-tight shirts and whatever. Now, what's also interesting, and this is something that I've learned over the years, is that it's not the same in every country. I've watched individuals on YouTube before who will go to foreign countries and they'll attempt to exercise in a foreign country, and they will have far more strict rules on what you can and cannot wear. For example, in Japan, when you exercise apparently in a gym in Japan or any kind of a fitness center, you basically have to be fully clothed and your clothes have to be baggy. So you can't, they won't even let you in. You can't wear anything that's skin tight. No skin is allowed to be shown, just your face. And then that's essentially it. But again, everybody's wearing sweatpants and they're wearing, hooded sweatshirts, and sometimes the hood is over their head, and, gloves and whatever else. But again, you can't dress revealingly or in any kind of a provocative way. But again, here in America, well, what do you have? You have everybody wearing skin-tight clothes in a gymnasium or a fitness center, and they're also filming one another to then take that footage and put it on the internet as if to say, look at me, here's how I look. That's problematic in itself too, for a variety of reasons. But again, this is gradualism. This is the problem. It's the slow degeneracy of our culture by completely hijacking a sex in the human race and getting them to look like something that they're not really supposed to look like. And then, of course, if you add in supplementation and females taking steroids to make their muscles look more masculine, well, it's quite possible you're talking about a separate mental issue and serious body issues and a deep-seated problem potentially from childhood on body dysmorphia and people not understanding that puberty is a real thing, and you let that run its course. And then again, light exercise as a basically late teenager is 100% fine. And then again, hopefully it just becomes a lifestyle, and an individual just engages in moderate exercise from time to time, and they eat right and take care of themselves, and that's completely normal. But what you see on YouTube is not normal. And that right there is, again, a perfect example of not just gradualism and sort of the end game of gradualism, but you're watching individuals who have a serious problem, in my professional opinion. Again, it's remarkably vain to consistently stare at yourself all of the time, and then, of course, take footage of yourself, and then take footage of yourself to then put on the internet for everybody to see. Again, it's a gym. Go back 15, 20 plus years and imagine yourself doing that, or that actually being a thing. And that right there should show people that, again, not only is it gradualism, but it's probably a perfect variable or an equation that was worked out by the Tavistock Institute or NGOs like it, because this was something that never used to exist in the past. See, that level of social engineering is something that's difficult for a lot of people to completely understand, let alone think about, that the thing that they're seeing is not natural, whether it be an activity or, again, some other social engineering, whatever, phenomenon that's taking place, that getting people to understand that these things are worked out in boardrooms by very evil people who know that they have their fingers on the right buttons in order to influence society and push it in one direction or another. Explaining this to people can be remarkably daunting. And I just don't think that everybody can certainly grasp the fact that we've all been victims of that manipulation on a variety of levels. But some of it just takes hold, and then it, of course, controls a person's entire life and their entire existence. And yet they have no idea that the things that they're doing, that they have made a part of themselves, are not natural. Again, it's just another level of complete subversive manipulation. And explaining that to someone, of course, who's made it such a part of their lives would be very difficult, I think, to get them to understand such a thing. Even if you read them that article, and they're like, hey, see this article here? It explains a great deal. So this is why you're doing the thing you're doing. I don't know. It's exhausting. Anyway, let me move on to this. This is interesting too, and this right here leans right into the jab stuff, and you talk about, again, subversive manipulation here. This was from a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago to be precise, from the University of Maryland and their School of Public Health. Now, I put this out on Gab when this first came out, but I want to go through this very quickly. Rumor has it that the University of Maryland's School of Health put this particular article out in this so-called study regarding the N95 masks, those big duck-billed, weird-looking things, where, of course, in the past, and this right here is, again, the subversive psychology in this entire thing, and constant manipulation. But in the past, those masks, as we all know, said this is not a medical device. No one should ever be wearing these, and you certainly shouldn't be wearing them for extended periods of time because you'll suffocate yourself, and so on and so on and so on. And it would even say so on the physical mask itself. That, of course, didn't stop anybody from wearing them for something that doesn't exist. Again, you talk about manipulation. The mask wearing was a perfect IQ test for all of that. But the University of Maryland School of Public Health put out this story saying that those masks are the best. And again, rumor has it that they purposefully manipulated this study in an effort to make this their go-to example for if they were to have mask wearing come back for a quote-unquote bird flu or whatever it is that they think that they're planning in the future. So we'll have to see whether or not this particular study gets referenced in the future, but here's what it says. It says, study shows N95 masks near perfect at blocking escape of airborne COVID-19. Again, all of this is fake. And here in just a little bit, once I'm done with this article, I'm going to play some audio from Dr. Kaufman and Steve Kirsch, because the two of them had a debate. And again, you know my threshold for debate, but in their conversation, it's very easy right out of the gate to figure out, of course, that Dr. Kaufman knows way more than Steve Kirsch does. And Steve Kirsch is doing his best to play an I gotcha moment when he can't. So Dr. Kaufman, of course, knows that viruses don't exist. He knows the entire history of it. And unfortunately, Steve Kirsch thinks that viruses are real. He's dead wrong, but he doesn't want to be wrong. And that's why I don't like debating, because you usually have someone who is right and someone who just does not want to be wrong. And again, the audio is absolutely incredible because at the very beginning, Kaufman basically says, well, here's the scientific method. And then Steve Kirsch basically fires back and says, well, we're probably going to disagree on some of that, but whatever, let's just move forward. And Kaufman looks at him and goes, well, if we're going to disagree on the scientific method, then there's nothing to talk about. There's nowhere to go here, and the conversation should probably just end, Steve. And it didn't. It went on for, almost 2 hours. But it was incredible. And at the end of the entire thing, Steve Kirsch looked like a sweaty loser. He had nowhere to stand. And Kaufman was just calm the entire time. But again, I'll play a little bit of that in just a second. But here's the article. Again, it says, study finds all masks effective. So keep that in mind. Again, they think that all masks are effective. It says, but duckbill N95 masks far outperform others. Suggests they should be standard in high-risk setting. And then they have a picture of all the different kinds of masks, and it makes it look like in this completely manipulated picture that virus is all over the person's face and all around their head, but if you're wearing an N95 mask, there's less of it, in particular the duckbill one. Again, they want everybody to be walking around looking like a duck. That's essentially what this is. Here's what it says, College Park, Maryland. It says, in a head-to-head comparison of masks worn by people with active COVID-19, the inexpensive duckbill N95 mask came out on top, stopping 98% of COVID-19 particles in the breath of infected people from escaping into the air. It says, led by researchers from the University of Maryland School of Public Health, results showed other masks also performed well, blocking at least 70% of viral particles from escaping from the source, an infected person's exhaled breath. Ladies and gentlemen, that entire paragraph is a lie. The entire thing. Not once has it been proven or shown, after all of this time, that illness is spread through coughing on somebody and or sneezing on them. This is centuries old, a century and a half plus, if not longer than that. It's absolutely amazing, not to mention COVID. If there were really COVID and people could really see a quote-unquote virus, you would take an unvaccinated individual who is showing symptoms of being ill, spit on one of those stupid COVID tests, which doesn't test for anything, and then it would test positive. So the individual who believes the test and believes that COVID is a real thing and that this individual is sick because of COVID, they would have all of the evidence that they would need to actually believe that this individual is ill with COVID. But if that were true, then they would be able to have that individual cough in the face of someone else, and that someone else would then by default have to become sick. But that didn't happen, and that doesn't happen. They could also, of course, have that individual cough into a jar or cough on a petri dish and look underneath it and look into it with a microscope and clearly see, oh, look, there's COVID. It's right there. We can see it. That's never happened either. That's the basis for everything that we're witnessing even to this day. The entire thing was an absolute fairy tale. This article goes on. It says the study, Relative Efficacy of Masks and Respirators as Source Control for Viral Aerosol Shedding from People Infected with SARS-CoV-2, that was the title, published May 29th in eBiomedicine, a Lancet journal. It says, quote, the research shows that any mask is much better than no mask, and an N95 is significantly better than the other options. That's the number one message, unquote, says the study's senior author, Dr. Donald Milton. Milton is a UMD SPH professor of environmental health and a global expert on how viruses spread through the air. His entire career is based on a lie. Again, you talk about social manipulation and subversive manipulation. These people have no idea that the thing they've been doing their whole life is a lie. It says the study started in May of 2020, shortly after the pandemic began. There was no pandemic. And compared breath samples from volunteers who had active COVID-19, testing the performance of 4 commonly used masks, even without giving participants fit tests or training on how to wear the mask correctly. All masks significantly reduced the amount of virus escaping into the air. The study tested masks as a way to control the spread of the virus from the source, i.e., the infected person, and did not test masks as protection from COVID-19 in the surrounding air. This is so exhausting. Again, the enemy wants to use this particular mask study as their foundation for anything that they do in the future here. This is the one. It says, quote, because COVID-19 is airborne, no, we focused on the extent to which wearing a mask reduces contamination of the air around you, Milton says. It says the latest study is a continuation of investigations by UMD's Public Health Aerobiology Lab, or Fab Lab, into how contagious respiratory viruses such as influenza contaminate the air. There you go. See, they're even tying it into the flu. That's why masks haven't gone away. That's why you still see the occasional whack job wearing a mask. Well, it's flu season and I don't want to get anybody else sick. Okay. Keep taking your shots, keep wearing your mask, watch what happens. It goes on here. It says researchers asked volunteers with COVID-19 to breathe into a unique contraption known as a, good lord, Geist Height 2 machine. I'm saying that right? Developed by Milton and colleagues to measure viruses in exhaled breath. Participants who breathed into the machine for 30 minutes at a time were asked to do a variety of vocalizations, such as repeating the alphabet, singing happy birthday, and even honoring UMD's mascot by repeatedly shouting, "Go Terps." That's funny. I mean, why not just dance on one foot and rub your stomach and pat the top of your head at the exact same time? I mean, it's a humiliation ritual, but it's incredible because everybody's being humiliated because they have no idea the thing they're testing doesn't even exist. It goes on, it says in each instance, researchers measured the amount of viral particles in the exhaled breath of volunteers, pairing each 30-minute session of breathing with a mask on, with another 30-minute session with no mask. It says data from our study suggests that a mildly symptomatic person with COVID-19 who is not wearing a mask exhales a little over 2 infectious doses per hour. Bullshit. It says first author, Dr. Jiao Liu or Lao or Lei, I don't know, a postdoctoral researcher at the Fab Lab. Quote, But when wearing an N95 mask, the risk goes down exponentially. Yes, I'm sure it does. It's all a humiliation ritual. The duckbill N95 mask, it says, blocked 99% of large particles and 98% of small particles from escaping out of a person's mask. Milton says the design's tight seal, a powerful filter, and large airspace for breath to move around all contribute to the duckbill's success. A powerful filter, you say? Well, what's that catching? What is it doing? They have no idea. Surprisingly, it says, KN95 masks, the disposable masks widely used, were no more effective than cloth or surgical masks. The study found that a common brand of KN95 masks leak more air than duckbills or other studied masks because they don't conform to the face well. That flaw is compounded by a powerful filter with more flow resistance that pushes air out of the mask at the sides instead of through the filter, allowing more virus particles to escape into the surrounding air. These people, they believe this. They absolutely believe it. It's brainwashing 101. This is absolutely nuts. Cloth masks also outperformed both KN95 and surgical masks. Milton theorizes that cloth masks with greater coverage, wrap around the face and give a better seal than either the KN95 or surgical masks. With cloth mask filters, flow resistance is also lower, allowing breath to pass through the filter and not leak out the sides of the mask. It says limiting the amount of viral particles in the air is a key way to control highly contagious respiratory viruses in general, Milton said. This is even more the case with the COVID-19 virus, given transmissibility has increased over time, with Omicron in particular breaking through the immunity people developed from vaccinations or prior infections. Unflippin' believable. The excuses that they're making, and just the back handstands and the flipping and the this and the that. I'm skipping to the end of this. Get a load of this here. At the very end of this, it says duckbill N95 masks should be the standard of care in high-risk situations such as nursing homes and healthcare settings. Now, when the new outbreak of a severe respiratory virus occurs, we know exactly how to help control the spread with this simple and inexpensive solution, unquote. So saith one of the researchers, that Asian postdoctoral student. Unbelievable. Who's associated with this, you might ask? Well, the University of Maryland, of course, School of Public Health, the James Clark School of Engineering, the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Infectious Disease Epidemiology and Control at the University of Hong Kong in China. And at the very bottom, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and a grant from, you guessed it, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and by a gift from the Flu Lab, quote unquote. And that's the end of the article. This, again, is going to be their basis for pushing duckbill masks on everybody and anybody in the future, in particular in healthcare settings, as they say. So the small little, reach into the box and grab your teeny little surgical mask. No, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to get way worse than that if you're working in a hospital. The N95s are going to be out there. And oh my God, everybody walking around looking like a duck-billed platypus. It's just going to be crazy. Can you imagine someone today wanting to be a nurse? I mean, they're literally walking into a buzzsaw. If you want to be in the medical profession, again, either as a doctor, a nurse, whatever, I mean, you have to drink all of this in and be completely blind and totally shut off to what's going on in the world. Because wearing one of those masks is going to be standard, not to mention, of course, taking the shots. Any time that I hear of an individual saying, well, they got into nursing school, or they're going into medical school, or they're pre-med, or they're this or they're that, I'm saying to myself, do they have any idea how many injections they have to take just to attend the school, let alone attempt to engage in the actual profession? of which they probably won't even survive. It's amazing. Absolutely incredible. Again, I hear of someone wanting to be a nurse. I think, goodbye. It's over for you then. Unless, of course, you somehow can jump over all of the hurdles and avoid all of the, the so-called hoops that they want you to jump through in order to just, again, attend, let alone get hired someplace. It's amazing. Now, let me read this real quick before I play the audio from Dr. Kaufman and Steve Kirsch from this past week. This was on the expose, and it also came from Catherine Watt. It says that Catherine Watt's been corresponding with a reader who is researching the history of the U.S. public health and regulatory agencies. And here's what the title of the article said. It said, FDA is a front organization. There are no technicians in the buildings, no equipment, and no sample testing occurs. It says records before 1973 are difficult to locate. However, what has become clear is that the origins of these agencies are not what they make them out to be. Why are they lying about their origins? Because, Watt says, quote, they have maintained a bunch of empty office buildings that serve only as a mailing address. It says there are no technicians in the buildings, no equipment, and no sample testing occurs. So this particular article, again, was written by Catherine Watt, and it was titled, On FDA Buildings as Virtual Mailboxes to Project the Public Illusion of Biological Product Manufacturing Regulation. It says one of the questions the reader is trying to answer has to do with whether Biological Regulation Authority was ever statutorily established by the U.S. Congress for NIH and its precursor organizations going back to the late 1800s. It says modern-day NIH and FDA officials present historical accounts of how the biological product and vaccine manufacturing regulatory systems began and developed. But from her research so far, the reader has concluded that their origin story claims are not supported by the text of the statuses they cite. During an email exchange recently, she raised the question, quote, why are they lying, unquote, about their statutory and or administrative origins. I sent her a reply with my hypothesis about why NIH and FDA lie about their origins and evolution. And here's what Catherine Watt said. She said, quote, the why they are lying question is the one I've been mulling for a few months. My hypothesis is that they have maintained a bunch of empty office buildings that serve only as a mailing address without having an actual technical staff, laboratory equipment, or application and sample processing procedures. She said they do that so that they can have fake forms for vaccine manufacturers to fill out. These included both the established license application, ELA, and product license application, PLA, from 1973 to the mid-1900s. It says ELA plus PLA application processes became, in the mid-1900s, the Biologics License Application, or BLA, by eliminating even the ostensible fake requirement for establishment, inspectors, and licensing, and by breaking up the quote-unquote responsible head at the factories into multiple responsible people so that no one would be responsible. The factory employees, who are also just a handful of paper pushers with no scientific knowledge or responsibility in a building whose equipment just makes immunotoxic junk and puts it in vials and slaps labels on it, filled out the application forms and mailed them to the FDA addresses, Bureau of Biologics in 1973, all its NIH predecessors, and FDA successors, Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, SBER now. It says the application forms arrived at that address where another one or two paper pushers put them in a filing cabinet and then shredded them a few years later. Since the advent of electronic filing systems, the application and licensing forms have been filed, transferred, and stored electronically and deleted at regular intervals. There are no technicians in the buildings, there's no equipment, and there's no sample testing occurs. It says it's all a front. Statutes, regulations, procedures, application forms, buildings, addresses, offices, labs, approved applications, and licenses sent by the FDA back to the factories, everything. A handful of people at pharma companies know it. A handful of people at the FDA know it. And everyone else just assumes that a different specialized department with specialized staff equipment and procedures is handling it somewhere in a factory and somewhere within the FDA, unquote. Again, I got to tell you, this right here again continues to prove exactly what Melissa McAtee was talking about with Justin Leslie when the two of them, the Pfizer whistleblowers, were on with Greg Reese. It's the same kind of thing. Melissa was openly saying, look, I have a high school education. I think she had 1 semester of college, if I'm not mistaken, and then she applied for a position at Pfizer and she got it. It's not that these individuals have to have particular credentials in order to work there and, again, slap stickers on vials and fill out paperwork and move this over here and move that over there. She proved that. She openly said that. She goes, the people that work in these buildings aren't necessarily the brightest. They just do what they're told. They're given an order, and then they take it, and then they get paid. And you can work your way up depending on how many orders you're willing to take, and that's the way that it works. This right here proves it. It's amazing. The FDA doesn't really even exist. It's just a bunch of paper pushers. They're not actually testing anything. Probably a handful of lawyers as well. You have to assume that. It's amazing. It's a criminal organization. There's no other way around it. Okay, now let me get to this. The Kaufman-Kirsch debate. Absolutely hilarious. And again, in summary, you know my threshold for debates is next to 0. And rightfully so, because unfortunately the people who engage in them, you usually have one person who is very right and one person who is very not right. And that certainly happens to be the case here. So, this took place on Thursday, June 13th. And again, it lasted almost 2 hours. I'm just going to play the very beginning of this because I want you to, again, hear Kirsch's tone and then hear Kaufman's tone. And again, if you actually watch this, it's over on my Gab, and you can, of course, look this up on Rumble. But if you want to watch this from a nonverbal communication standpoint, the simple fact that Kirsch is behaving the way that he is completely proves his cognitive dissonance is in full effect. He's sweating, he's slimy, he's moving around, he's yelling, he even engages in some name-calling and some defamation, and Kaufman's having none of it. He's just sitting there calmly. He'll pose a question back to Steve. Steve can't answer it. It's incredible. In fact, I'm not going to play this particular part, but later on in the debate, they start to go back and forth over what replication is. And replication is that you should be able to replicate the existence of a so-called virus from one petri dish to the next, where you can watch it naturally occur or naturally evolve. Kirsch describes this, and then Kaufman says, wait a minute, the basis for it is completely false because there is no COVID. So what exactly are you replicating? And he goes, well, we've seen it. We've done it. It's been replicated. It's evolved from this dish to this dish to this dish, and it's done it 4 times. And Kaufman goes, wait a minute. He goes, what did you start with? And he goes, well, we started with monkey kidney cells. We started with monkey kidney, and he's like, that's not COVID. That's a monkey kidney cell. Where's the COVID? Where does it exist? He had Kirsch dead to rights because it doesn't exist. They even got into the whole testing thing. Kirsch thinks that the tests are valid. They're clearly not. Kaufman knows this. What are they testing for? To create a test for something that apparently exists, for the test to be valid, you have to have something that you're testing, and that thing has to be valid. But it doesn't exist. So what is the test actually testing? The answer is nothing. It's not testing for anything. Again, the answer to these problems is so simple, it's almost laughable. But I'm just going to start with, again, the very beginning of this debate because it already goes off the rails very quickly, like within the first 5 minutes. So give this a listen in 3, 2, 1.
I'm going to just race into Steve Kirsch. Let me bring on the founder of VSRF. Welcome to VSRF Live. Steve, how are you this evening?
I'm good, Livio.
I am looking forward to this conversation. I was talking to Dr. Kaufman backstage before you came on, and I already learned quite a bit about my own history, so I'm really looking forward to this.
As am I.
Well, let me just bring him on right now. without too much jabber, hello, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Welcome to VSRF Live.
Oh, hello again, Livio, and nice to meet you, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Sure, thanks for being on.
I'm going to quickly read your bio so that people that don't know about you get a greater understanding, and then I'll leave you and Steve at it. So here we go. Dr. Andrew Kaufman is a forensic psychiatrist and molecular biologist. He became more and more skeptical of the allopathic paradigm until he finally blew germ theory wide open and became a COVID whistleblower. Since then, he has been speaking and teaching the truth about medicine, viruses, natural healing, and other important subjects such as economics, law, education, and science. Dr. Kaufman received his Bachelor's of Science in Biology at Steve's alma mater, MIT, his MD from the University of South Carolina, and did a psychiatric residency at Duke University. Dr. Kaufman has served on medical school faculty, has been a leader in academics and professional organizations, and has conducted and published original research. He patented a medical device and ran a startup company. He has also testified as an expert witness in local, state, and federal court. Quite an impressive resume, Dr. Kaufman. Thank you for being here. And I want to remind our audience, put your questions, all caps questions, in the chat, and we will have a Q&A later. Ask questions for Dr. Kaufman and for Steve. Take it away, gentlemen.
All right. Well, first of all, just for time's sake, what's the, Dr. Kaufman, I think you need to leave in about an hour and a half from now. Is that right? So we should make sure that we have plenty of room for questions from the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good time frame. I'm on the East Coast, so it's a little bit later.
Okay. So I'm going to try to target us believe that there shouldn't be a mask, any kind of mask regulations, that masks don't work, that lockdowns were ineffective, that we shouldn't have vaccine mandates, that science was not being done properly, and that there was a lack of autopsies that should have been done when people died from what they claimed is the virus or the vaccine. Is that,
all
is that fair?
good points. All good points, Steve.
Good. And I think we also agree on how science works, that the hypothesis that better explains the data should win at the end of the day.
Well, it depends on how the data is acquired, Steve, because science, we have to stick to the scientific method and its attributes and what it can be applied towards, and separate that from other things purporting to be science, which are really observation or simulation, things like epidemiology, like computer modeling, in vitro studies, things like that.
Okay, but hard data, it can be collected in a variety of different ways, that if you have the proper hypothesis, that you should be able to explain the hard data versus the model data or the artificially created data, right?
Well, like I'm saying again, Steve, the data has to be generated through a scientific experiment in order to generate a cause and effect relationship. You can have data that is worthless. Like, for example, when I was at Duke, they made a big announcement while I was in my training that they had found definitive evidence that serotonin receptors are involved in depression. And what happened is they had a large data set that was from nursing homes across the country, and they found an anomaly that suggested to them that there was a genetic finding, like of a gene for depression. And they were really excited. There was like a cocktail party, like impromptu in the department. It was like people were celebrating like mad. And then 2 weeks later, I noticed that there was no further talk about it. And what had happened is several other groups with similar data sets found out it was just a statistical anomaly because they were data mining, and they essentially encountered an anomaly and then misinterpreted it as an actual finding. So that's because all they had was a big set of data. It wasn't data that was from an experiment designed to test a hypothesis of cause and effect. It was just kind of data that was for another purpose, for another experiment, that they were just put into a big number crunching, software, and essentially ran simulations and then came up with false conclusions.
Okay, so I'm sure we could spend another hour on that topic, but in the interest of moving on, let's just say I don't completely agree with what you're saying. I think that data is data, and you can what science should do is interpret that data and assess whether or not that data is going to be reliable or not. And
Well, now,
that's part of
if we
this.
can't,
That's part of science.
if we can't stick to the scientific method where there's an independent variable, there's a control, there's a dependent variable, that's the only way you can essentially ascertain scientifically any cause and effect relationships.
Okay, well, like I said, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on that, but let's move on.
This is the scientific method is well published and agreed upon throughout the world of science. So if you disagree with that, I don't know what we could talk about.
Okay. So let me give you an example. I claim that if you take a golf club and you hit a golf ball, that the club is actually causing the golf ball to move, and it's the contact with the club that causes the golf ball to move, and it's not the air of the golf club that causes the ball to move ahead of the club hitting the ball.
So
okay, but I don't need to go. Do I need to do a? I don't believe that I need to do a randomized control trial in order to figure stuff like that out. Or if I jump out of a plane with a parachute and the parachute doesn't work, will I die or not? We don't need to do a randomized double-blind trial on jumping out with or without a parachute.
Well, two things. One, a randomized double-blind trial is not necessarily a scientific experiment because it's not designed to highlight or prove a cause and effect relationship in nature. It's done for pharmaceuticals, which are man-made. But the other thing is you could actually, now, of course, I agree, you don't need to necessarily do an experiment to see if the club is moving the ball, but you could do an experiment, right, where you could swing just air and you could swing the club, and the club would be the independent variable, and the dependent variable would be the motion of the ball. And the control would be swinging air instead of swinging the club. So when you're talking about invisible things, you do need to very carefully design and perform these experiments because it's not so obvious as observing someone swinging a golf club.
Okay, so you're saying that all retrospective observational trials are completely useless because you couldn't control anything in the environment that you're observing. You had to take the data that you were given. And you didn't control for that. You didn't. You control for it after the fact, but or you try to control for it after the fact. But you're saying that observational studies are junk. Is that?
No, I'm not saying they're junk. I'm just saying they're not science because you can't make any cause and effect conclusion out of. Well, let me just finish. Yeah. So observational data like epidemiology is only useful to generate hypotheses. You can't conclude anything. If you can conclude things from that, then you're basically saying that causation equals association.
Okay, well, like I said, we could spend a lot of time going down this particular topic, but I really want to focus on what you're about here with the whether viruses exist or not. So I think we just need to table this because otherwise we're just not going to get anywhere in this call.
Well, this is the framework for this discussion, Steve, because we're going to talk about a scientific claim of cause and effect of a natural phenomenon. And so you can only get to the answer of that with using the scientific method. You can't get to that answer with epidemiological data. And any epidemiologists will also admit that.
Okay, well, let's just move on and maybe we can go back to this point if we need to.
I'm going to stop it there. It goes off the rails after that. It flat out goes off the rails. Kirsch loses his mind. I mean, he just gets louder and louder and louder, more and more argumentative. Kaufman isn't. He's calm and cool as a cucumber the entire time. There was even a point in their back and forth where Kirsch looks at him and goes, "So do you even believe in gravity? What about gravity? Do you believe in that?" And I mean, Kaufman was kind of wrong on the issue because you can't observe something that's completely made up. The term gravity itself is just a work of fiction to basically cover for the existence of density and buoyancy. Now, that's a separate issue, but again, they have this very petty back and forth regarding that. And then at one point, when Kaufman was actually trying to reference 4 studies that he actually sent Kirsch's writing team, Kirsch just goes, "Yeah, I never got those studies." He goes, "What do you mean you didn't get them?" He goes, "Your team asked me to send them, and I sent them to them so that you could have them and have time to read them before we even talked." He goes, "Yeah, my team never sent me anything." He goes, "Why did they ask me for them then? And why are we talking about them now, and I'm bringing them up now, and you don't even know what we're talking about?" I mean, he made Kirsch look completely unprepared. And again, there was a point in the debate, too, just in conclusion, where Kaufman openly said, "Look, there are some people who are interested in figuring out what the truth is, and then there are some people who are just interested in becoming rich and famous." And that's it. He's 100% right. Those people are everywhere. And that certainly exists in the so-called scientific realm or the scientific field. It's incredible. But again, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll link that in the description below if you want to watch the entire thing. It's exhausting. But man, it just, again, you've heard me bash Steve Kirsch on the show before. I've never been a fan of his. I've read a couple of his articles, a couple of the points that he's made, but he's immovable on the entire COVID lie. He's totally immovable on it. And you have to take into consideration, he's double jabbed at least. He, his wife, his kids, and he looks terrible. He looks ill. So there's that aspect too. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to end it there. Thank you for listening as always, and I will catch you on Wednesday. Peace. Thank you for listening to American Education FM. Make sure and check out AmericanEducationFM.com for more information. Take care and God bless.